B-2 Spirit versus the world's radars. The Phantom awakens. Whiteman Air Force Base was quiet under the Missouri night, its runways shimmering faintly under floodlights. Inside Hangar 5 sat the B-2 Spirit, a black triangle of mystery and menace. For decades, the bomber had slipped into hostile skies unseen, striking targets and vanishing like a ghost. Colonel Michael Davis, a veteran of countless sorties, approached the aircraft with measured steps. This wasn't a combat mission. Tonight, the Spirit would face something more dangerous than missiles, the world's most advanced radars. Recent months had been filled with bold claims. Russia boasted its S-500s could erase stealth from the battlefield. China paraded prototypes of quantum radars said to catch the invisible. Even smaller nations like Iran insisted their Russian-built systems could track America's ghosts. If true, the era of stealth superiority could be ending. The Pentagon needed answers. Davis and his co-pilot, Major Elena Ramirez, were chosen to fly a high-stakes gauntlet, a global mission to test the Spirit against the strongest sensors on Earth. Not with bombs, but with survival. Inside the cockpit, bathed in instrument glow, Ramirez broke the silence. "Think they'll see us?" "Not if we're what they say we are," Davis replied, steadying his hands on the throttle. The engines came alive, muted and smooth, designed to mask heat and sound. The B-2 rolled forward, then rose effortlessly into the dark sky. In moments it vanished, its silhouette swallowed by night. Thousands of miles away, radar operators in fortified bunkers watched their screens, unaware that history's most elusive aircraft was already in the air, daring them to find it. The chase had begun. Europe's Iron Curtain. The Spirit's first trial waited over Eastern Europe. Intelligence had confirmed that Poland and the Baltic states, aided by Russian engineers, had built a phased array radar network, a modern Iron Curtain of electromagnetic eyes. Unlike traditional radars, these didn't just sweep for reflections. They scanned for the tiniest disturbances in the electromagnetic field, hoping to catch whispers of stealth aircraft. Colonel Davis leveled the B-2 at 40,000 feet, adjusting its profile to minimize radar returns. The Spirit's edges absorbed and scattered beams, but modern arrays weren't easily fooled. In a Warsaw command bunker, operators studied glowing screens. "Possible airborne trace," Sector 9, one reported. The blip was faint, like a candle in a storm. His commander frowned. Classification: signal-to-noise ratio too low, could be weather clutter. But the trace reappeared, this time more defined. Heads turned. Could it be the stealth bomber they had been told about? Before they could verify, the contact vanished, erased as quickly as it appeared. On board the Spirit, Ramirez glanced at her console. "We brushed their net." Davis adjusted the throttle slightly, altering the angle of approach, and slipped through it. His voice was steady. But the reality was clear. The phased array curtain had nearly caught them. Back in Warsaw, frustration spread through the bunker. "We had it then, nothing," the commander muttered. Billions of dollars invested, and still the ghost had passed. Above the clouds, unseen, the B-2 pressed on. One line of defense had faltered. Many more awaited. Leaving Europe behind, the Spirit banked north into the icy skies above Scandinavia. Here lay one of the most unusual challenges. Over the horizon, radars OT highs. Unlike conventional systems, these didn't need line of sight. By bouncing signals off the ionosphere, they could scan thousands of kilometers beyond the horizon, detecting missile launches, ships, and at least in theory even stealth bombers. Davis and Ramirez knew the threat. Stealth shaping worked best against short and medium-wave radars, but OTHRs operated in long wavelengths where geometry mattered less. The only hope was deception blending into the electromagnetic clutter of auroras, solar interference, and atmospheric noise. Inside a Norwegian bunker, operators tracked faint disturbances. "We have something," one said, tapping his screen. The trace was smooth, consistent, too deliberate to be natural. Another shook his head. "No, the pattern matches auroral scatter." Background interference. For 20 minutes, debate filled the room. Some swore they were tracking an aircraft, others dismissed it as static. Data blurred, shifted, and dissolved. By the time consensus began forming, the Spirit had already crossed the radar's field and slipped beyond reach. Riding the static, Ramirez muttered, impressed at Davis' precision. Every subtle course correction had kept their signal buried in the noise. Davis allowed himself a thin smile. "If they can't agree on what they're seeing, then we were never there." Below, the Arctic stretched on, white and endless. The Norwegian radar crews would write reports filled with uncertainty, but uncertainty wasn't enough. The Phantom had glided through their gaze, leaving only questions in its wake. The Arctic eyes had blinked, and the Spirit moved on to its next trial. The Bear's Den. The real test loomed ahead. Grishar, Moscow's pride. The S-500 system was more than a missile battery. It was a layered network of radars, satellites, and airborne early warning aircraft, designed with one purpose: to hunt stealth. If any defense could corner the Spirit, this was it. Colonel Davis guided the B-2 toward the Baltic approaches, its matte black skin blending with the night. Warning tone suddenly chimed in the cockpit brief, but enough to raise the stakes. "We've been painted," Ramirez warned, scanning her console. In a command center near Kaliningrad, a Russian operator leaned over his scope. Unidentified target, bearing 215s. The contact was weak, but it was there. Excitement rippled through the room. Orders barked. Other radars swung to assist, overlapping scans to trap the Phantom. Davis reacted instantly. He released radar-reflective decoy small pods that mimicked the radar cross-section of larger aircraft. On Russian screens, 3, then 4, echoes appeared. "Which one's real?" the colonel in charge demanded. His operators hesitated. Each return looked authentic, but none held steady. Within seconds, the original faint signal disappeared altogether. Meanwhile, Davis dove smoothly, dropping altitude to merge with ground clutter. The Spirit vanished from the Russian network like mist in sunlight. Back in Kaliningrad, frustration turned to disbelief. "We had it," one officer said bitterly. Then, nothing. The colonel slammed his fist on the table. Billions invested, and still the ghost escaped. Inside the cockpit, Davis steadied his breathing. That had been too close. "The bear swiped," he murmured, but missed. Ramirez exhaled slowly, eyes locked on the horizon. The Spirit pushed on, leaving Russia's vaunted shield behind untouched, but not unchallenged. The Dragon's Lattice. Beyond the Pacific horizon lay the Dragon's Lattice, China's dense network of radars stretching across its coastline and islands in the South China Sea. Unlike the scattered systems in Europe and Russia, this was a web, long-wave radars for distant detection, phased arrays for precision, and, most worrying of all, experimental quantum radars. Beijing claimed they had cracked the stealth puzzle. Colonel Davis wasn't convinced, but he knew tonight would give them their best chance. "This is where the myths get tested," he said. Ramirez gave a curt nod, eyes on her displays. As the Spirit crossed into range, Chinese operators in a command bunker on Hainan Island stiffened. "Unidentified trace detected," one reported. Unlike earlier radars, the contact didn't flicker, it held steady. Faint but consistent. Excitement filled the room. "We have it," quantum array confirms. For the first time, Davis felt the weight of being seen. "They're locking on," Ramirez warned. Davis switched tactics. He activated the Spirit's electronic countermeasures, flooding the spectrum with false signals. On Chinese screens, chaos erupted. Suddenly a dozen identical B-2 silhouettes appeared, scattering in all directions. "Which one is real?" shouted the duty officer. No one could tell. Commanders barked for clarity, but the lattice was overwhelmed, its data corrupted by deliberate noise. Within minutes, the original steady return dissolved into confusion. By the time technicians recalibrated, the Spirit had slipped past, silent and unseen once again. In the cockpit, Ramirez let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That was close. Davis adjusted their heading. "Close doesn't count. Ghosts don't leave shadows." The Dragon's Lattice had caught a glimpse, but only a glimpse of the Phantom. The Desert Watchers. The Spirit glided into the Middle East, where Iran's radar network stretched across desert and mountain. Tehran boasted that its Russian-made systems could detect stealth fighters, even claiming to have tracked a B-2 once before. Tonight, Davis and Ramirez would learn how much truth lay in those claims. Dropping lower, Davis guided the bomber close to the terrain. Sand dunes, jagged cliffs, and rocky valleys created natural clutter that confused radar beams. The B-2's skin scattered the signals further, dissolving its outline into background noise. Inside a control bunker near Tehran, operators leaned forward. "Unidentified contact," bearing 2301 reported. The echo was weak, vanishing and reappearing like a mirage. His superior frowned. Classification could be a drone, could be birds. Not steady enough to confirm. Still, missile crews were placed on alert. Screens flickered, faint traces appeared, then dissolved again. Some operators swore they saw an aircraft. Others dismissed it as interference. Without certainty, no one dared authorize a launch. In the cockpit, Ramirez smirked. "They don't trust their own eyes." "That's stealth," Davis replied calmly. "Doubt is our weapon." Minutes later, the last trace disappeared into desert noise. Iranian officers slammed fists on consoles in frustration. Their billion-dollar systems had glimpsed a ghost but failed to catch it. Above the sands, the B-2 soared westward, untouched. Another test passed. Another myth of stealth detection reduced to whispers. The rising sun's secret. After threading past Iran's defenses, the Spirit angled east, skirting along the Pacific toward Japan. Unlike adversaries, Tokyo was an ally. But their next-generation radar arrays, designed to track hypersonic weapons, represented some of the most advanced sensors in the world. For Davis and Ramirez, this was both a challenge and an opportunity. If the Spirit could slip past Japan's radars, it could slip past almost anything. "Friendly territory," Ramirez noted, glancing at the map. "Friendly, yes," Davis replied. "But tonight, they're part of the test." High above the ocean, the B-2 glided along the edge of Japanese airspace. In a control center outside Tokyo, operators watched their screens. These systems were engineered to catch even fleeting objects moving at Mach speeds, If stealth was truly obsolete, this was where the spirit would be revealed. Minutes passed, nothing appeared. The radars hummed with perfect precision, their sweeps crisp and clean. Yet the sky seemed empty. One operator frowned. Systems clear, no tracks. Check calibration, his supervisor ordered. The technician ran diagnostics. Everything was working flawlessly. Still, there was nothing to see. From the cockpit, Davis allowed himself a quiet smile. Even the best can't catch what isn't there. Ramirez nodded. Proof our edge still holds. Tokyo's radar crews eventually stood down, baffled. Their systems had functioned exactly as designed, yet history's most elusive bomber had passed undetected, a phantom in Allied skies. The spirit banked south, pressing toward its next trial. Each step forward confirmed the same truth. Stealth was not invincibility. But it was enough to turn certainty into doubt and doubt into survival. Eyes beyond radar. For decades, radars had been the spirit's greatest adversary and greatest victim. But now, a new threat waited on the horizon. IRST systems, infrared search and track sensors, didn't rely on radar beams. Instead, they hunted by heat, sniffing out the faint thermal signature of engines against the cold sky. Some argued this was the true counter to stealth. Tonight, Davis and Ramirez would find out. Over the Indian Ocean, a pair of advanced fighters, foreign aggressors flying Su-35s, were tasked with a simulated intercept. Their orders proved that IRST could see what radar could not. From the ground, controllers vectored them toward the B-2's flight path. The fighters swept the skies with radar nothing. Then they switched to IRST. Contact, one pilot radioed. A faint glow shimmered in his scope. Possible target, bearing 090. He pushed his fighter forward. The closer he got, the stronger the signal became until suddenly it vanished. What happened? His wingman barked. The B-2 had shifted altitude, slipping into a cooler air layer. Its exhaust plumes mixed with the night air, masking its thermal trail. On the Su-35's scope, the signal dissolved into background heat from the ocean below. Lost it, the pilot muttered in frustration. From the spirit's cockpit, Ramirez monitored her instruments. They had us, then didn't. Ghost trick works both ways, Davis replied calmly. The fighters circled, scanning furiously, but their quarry was gone. The spirit slid through the night, proving once again that invisibility was not about being unseen, but about never being seen long enough to matter. The global net, the spirit had outpaced nations one by one, but now a more dangerous challenge awaited. This time it wasn't Russia alone, or China, or Iran. It was all of them, together. Through shared satellites, linked early warning radars, and joint air defense agreements, adversaries were experimenting with something new, a global detection net. Colonel Davis and Ramirez studied the briefing before entering contested skies. Every node shares its data instantly, Ramirez said, her tone clipped. One radar blinks and the rest no. No single blind spot. Davis leaned back in his seat. Then we make one. The spirit crossed into the network's coverage under a moonless sky. Above them, satellites scanned with infrared sensors, reporting anomalies to ground stations. Within minutes, operators across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Middle East saw the same thing. A faint, inconsistent contact at high altitude. Possible aircraft, an operator in Ankara reported. Track confirmed, came a voice from Moscow. Passing east, bearing steady, added a team in Tehran. For the first time, the spirit was being stalked by a shared eye, its trace bouncing across command centers from 3 continents. Inside the cockpit, a warning tone buzzed, multiple radars now sweeping simultaneously. Ramirez frowned. We're lit up. They're triangulating, not for long, Davis muttered. He triggered a complex countermeasure sequence. Pods released radar-reflective decoys, each mimicking the cross-section of heavy bombers. Simultaneously, the spirit shifted altitude, sliding into an electronic clutter zone where atmospheric distortion blurred radar returns. On global screens, the faint track multiplied. 1 became 3, then 6, then 10. Operators scrambled to sort the data. Which contact is real? Asked a French liaison. Target at grid Delta 7, someone in Moscow insisted. No, that one's false, countered an Iranian officer. The more the network shared, the worse the confusion grew. Algorithms tried to reconcile the conflicting inputs, but the spirit's decoys had been designed to exploit exactly that. Cheap's false return looked equally authentic. In a command bunker, frustration erupted. We built this net to eliminate doubt, and now it's nothing but doubt. As officers argued, the spirit banked sharply and slid into a blind corridor between radar sweeps. For 30 seconds, the net lost track completely. By the time satellites attempted reacquisition, the bomber had vanished into open airspace, leaving only ghost echoes drifting across monitors. Inside the cockpit, Ramirez's hands finally relaxed. They almost had us. Davis's voice was calm but resolute. Almost doesn't count a net this big. All it does is tangle itself. Across the globe, the coalition partners were left staring at cluttered screens, each nation convinced the others had lost the target. Billions in technology and years of coordination had failed to achieve what they promised. The spirit had slipped the grasp of the world united, just as easily as it had evaded nations alone. The Ghost's lesson. The B-2 spirit had flown through fireless battlefields of light radar beams, satellite sweeps, infrared sensors, and experimental quantum arrays. Each claimed invincibility. Each promised to expose the bomber's ghostly silhouette. And yet, as dawn broke over the horizon, Colonel Davis and Ramirez sat in the cockpit of the Spirit, untouched, unseen, still a shadow drifting through the sky. Across the globe, operators reviewed the night's chaos. In Moscow, they debated whether their fleeting contact had been real or illusion. In Beijing, engineers recalibrated their quantum radars, insisting that the faint signal must have been the Spirit, even if no one could prove it. In Tehran, commanders argued over whether birds or atmospheric interference had tricked their scopes. And in the coalition's grand global net, nations pointed fingers at each other, each blaming the other for losing the track. The truth was harsher. The B-2 had beaten them all not by brute force but by doubt. The Spirit's stealth wasn't about invisibility, it was about hesitation. Every radar operator who hesitated, every commander who delayed a launch order, every network that drowned itself in conflicting data, that was the bomber's victory. Seconds of uncertainty meant survival, and survival meant dominance. Inside the cockpit, Ramirez finally spoke, her voice soft, almost reverent. "We crossed the whole world, and no one could stop us." Davis's reply was steady, but his eyes betrayed the weight of it. That's the point of the Spirit. It isn't just metal and circuits, it's psychology. As long as they doubt, we win. She leaned back, exhaling. So, the Ghost lives on. The B-2 began its long return flight, its matte black frame blending with the early dawn. The mission would remain classified, hidden in sealed reports, yet whispers would ripple through radar rooms and defense ministries worldwide. We almost had it. We saw something, but then it was gone. And that was the Spirit's true power leaving the world chasing phantoms. Generals would demand upgrades, engineers would promise breakthroughs, operators would swear the next time would be different. But the lesson lingered like a shadow across the sky. Technology can measure, can track, can predict, but it cannot conquer uncertainty. The world's radars had united to hunt the Spirit. They had stared into the night, confident of victory, and the night had stared back, silent and mocking. The Spirit had flown across the planet, and no one could say, with certainty, that they had truly seen it. The Ghost had not just survived, it had triumphed.